Well, I'll assume we all know what this is. This is our home. This is where we live, along with many other creatures. And I think we can all agree that human beings did not create this planet. We may have constructed a few buildings, but we didn't create the earth. And so, according to our own intellectual property law, we do not own it. We just temporarily abide here, afforded a lease of life by the grace of God. Now, there may have been a time when humans were simply unaware of the consequences of their actions, and like children, could be forgiven for unwittingly making a mess of their place. However, today, as grown-up, intelligent beings with a world of information at our fingertips, there can be no genuine excuse for ignorance. There can only be a conscious choice to remain that way. And for any tenant to knowingly leave their place in a worse condition than they found it can only be regarded as deeply disrespectful. However, we appear to be doing just that. Here are just two statements as they read today, published on the websites of well-known scientific organisations, one from NASA and one from our own Met Office. I'll read them out in case you can't read them from the back. 97% of climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities, and most of the leading scientific organisations worldwide have issued public statements endorsing this position. That's from NASA. And our Met Office say, the scientific consensus states that it is very likely that most of the warming over the last 50 years is a result of greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activity. And this is not new information. We've known about this for some time. And the greenhouse gas that this human activity emits the most of is carbon dioxide. As you can see here, the scientists at this location in Hawaii have been monitoring the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere since the late 50s. Despite a clear upward trend, 30 years went by without any significant level of response until the late 80s with the formation of the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's right around where we burst through the 350 level that had been deemed as the safe upper limit, whatever that means. Meanwhile, back in 2013, despite all the high-level discussions, agreements and legal acts, we have for the most part been unwilling to give up our addiction to burning fossil fuels. We continue on a relentless course, due to hit 400 parts per million anytime soon. Clearly, the atmosphere is not responding to the introduction of carbon credits. Although we can't actually see this carbon dioxide in the air, many people around the world are experiencing the symptoms of its increasing concentrations. And yet, just as the tobacco industry attempted to convince us that smoking isn't harmful to our health, vested interests who put profit ahead of our planet's well-being continue to dilute the seriousness of our condition and actively spread false information. However, this disinformation is gleefully welcomed by those who wish to justify their resistance to personal change and shrug off their individual responsibility. So, in the UK, carbon dioxide makes up 83% of our total greenhouse gas emissions, according to the Department of Energy and Climate Change. 33% of that comes from our power stations, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels. The other sectors you see in the red colour include transport, housing and industry. So this is the the latest figures on the current mix of fuels that are used to generate our electricity. This is the period from the 1st of April 2012 to the end of March this year. So if we look at that breakdown of energy sources used for the generation of electricity feeding into our national grid, we can see that 66% is fossil fuels. That's coal and natural gas. So they're non-renewables, emitting carbon dioxide when you burn them. Renewables include wind, solar, hydro, wave and tidal, and biofuel, bioenergy. It's at 11% at the moment, with a government target set to reach 15% by 2020. Well, I wonder if that's enough. Denmark, for instance, have voluntarily increased their target to 35% by 2020. They also have a target of 100% renewables by 2050, which includes transport. Now, regardless of which energy company we choose as our supplier, whenever we draw electricity from the grid, it's all generated by a combination of these energy sources. The exact mix at any point in time will vary depending on demand and available supply. DEC have calculated that, for this period, each kilowatt hour or each unit of electricity consumed produces on average 470 grams of carbon dioxide. It's actually gone up from the previous year because our power plants burnt more coal. So even if you're on a green energy tariff, you're still contributing to the carbon dioxide emissions at the same rate as everyone else. You don't have a private cable running directly from their wind farm to your house. So when companies claim that their business is powered entirely by green or renewable energy and are still drawing electricity from the grid, then that statement is misleading. As are vehicle manufacturers who claim 0 grams of CO2 per kilometre for their vehicles if they're charging them from the grid. Now, I don't think this household in Stratford could get many more solar panels on their roof. The MCS, or Micro Generation Certification Scheme, that you need to have in order to qualify for the feed-in tariff. The installation standards require that you leave at least 200 millimetres clearance from the roof edges. Now, even though they've done about as much as they can, this particular household, to green up their electricity supply, this configuration simply isn't capable of meeting all their electrical needs. So they are still connected to the grid and will still be drawing from it at certain times. This diagram perhaps helps explain what's going on. The solar panels on the roof work in daylight. They don't generate electricity at night or when they're covered in snow, for example. So on a bright day with sufficient panels, enough electricity may be produced to run everything in the house so nothing is drawn from the grid. In the midst of summer, there may well be an overflow or excess of energy which is then exported to the grid and can be used by others. However, at night, electricity will be drawn from the grid, as it will on dull days when the panels are not producing enough energy to meet the home's demands, as in the midst of winter. In fact, any time the household electricity demand exceeds what the panels are generating, you're going to be drawing from the grid. So if you switch everything on at the same time, the cooker, the vacuum cleaner, the kettle, you're going to exceed 3 or 4 kilowatts. Now let's look at some actual data to illustrate that. This is an installation carried out by a local cooperative in Stratford called Community Energy Warwickshire. They funded this, and it's situated on the roof of the Stratford Hospital. It's a south-facing roof at about the optimum angle. We zoom in here. Oops, sorry. 52 panels. It's a 10 kilowatt array, if that means anything to you. And I've just got recently a clear year of performance data from them. Now note the typical shape of the solar resource in the UK. This, you can see, you probably can't from the back, but about the middle of the graph here is the middle of winter, Christmas time. And then it's the summer at the highest point. So this is very typical of the solar energy available. And it reflects the intensity of light and length of days. We obviously have short days in the winter, and we have longer days in the summer. We also have more intense light because of the higher position in the sky. So overall, this 10 kilowatt array generated approximately 10,000 units, 10,000 kilowatt hours in a year. So multiply, if you have one at home, multiply your array size by 1,000 and you've got your typical sort of output in Stratford, certainly. Okay. So we see that there's a significant variation between summer and winter. In fact, it looks about, on average, the winter production is about 1/6 of the summer production. And the winter energy demand is probably higher. Now let's just compare that to the shape of the wind resource. Okay, this is data from Wellesbourne Airfield for exactly the same period. The averages, this is average wind speed, and they're derived from data which is collected every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes the speed of the wind is recorded. This is at low level. So we're really looking just at the shape of this graph. And you can see it's fairly constant. There's not a huge variation as there is with the solar. And being January is better than July, in fact. And the standard assessment procedure, the SAP figures that we use to calculate energy efficiency of homes, does show in its data that January is normally higher than the rest of the year for wind, but this particular year it wasn't. Okay, now meeting your own electricity demand is even more challenging if your roof has dormer windows, skylights and other things breaking up the available area, or it isn't south facing, or just not very big. For maximum yield, the array needs to be south facing and at a 30-degree pitch. That's for a 52-degree latitude, which is about where we are now. On the whole, new build, and certainly existing housing stock, is not designed with energy independence in mind. For a home to be completely energy independent, it would need to be more like this. This is actually my design, and it's a result of a personal quest to prove that point. Now you note there's a large south-facing uninterrupted roof area with space for a much larger photovoltaic array. This is actually 9 kilowatts as opposed to the previous picture, which was 3 to 4 kilowatts. Plus energy efficiency in the construction. The way it's constructed is very energy efficient. And batteries store electricity locally for use at night and through periods of low solar generation. So if we go back again to that energy mix, there's a very strong, however, what I want to say is, yes, even if every home were built that way, the existing homes would still need to draw electricity from the grid, together with the consequential carbon dioxide emissions. Covering every roof with solar panels and making every home energy efficient is a great idea and makes a valuable contribution in reducing overall demand. However, as we've seen, with the currently available technology, you still need a grid supply to cover the shortfall. And with the increase of electrically powered transportation, there is undoubtedly going to be even more demand on the grid for charging these vehicles. So there's a very strong case for greening the grid. And this could be achieved if every district would willingly play its part in hosting some form of large-scale renewable energy generation. And of all the options available to us at this time, wind turbines appear to be the least consequential. Now, France is the third windiest country in Europe, next to Germany, and the UK is first. Now, 3 years ago, when visiting my parents, I had the opportunity to visit a wind farm near to where they live, sited in the district of Antoine, near the village of Lerner, about 6 months after they'd been installed. I also managed to get the technical details on the internet of the turbines there, and that's the specification on the left. You probably can't read the text from the back. They're using 4 Enercon E82 turbines, and I know that Broadview are stating undecided on their turbine supplier, so I hope it's not too unfair of me to put that up, the MM92 up there for comparison, but it's very similar size-wise, height-wise, and also the generation capacity at 2,000 kilowatts, although they've said it's 2 to 3, so we don't know exactly what it's going to be, but that's what's installed at this place at France. Okay, and then I just put this one in case we needed clarity on hub height. Hub height is the distance, as I understand it, to the centre of the rotor, and then you have the rotor diameter. Half the rotor diameter on top of that gives you the total height to the tip. Okay, so coming up to, as we approach, I remember feeling quite excited at this point. We'd seen them off in the distance as we were driving off along the main road to Samur, and I said, "Hey Dad, can we go over there and check out those windmills?" I was like a kid on an adventure as we found our way over to them. Finally I was going to get to experience these things for myself rather than through the opinions of others. Now just note the position of the blades on this first shot, and a few moments later I took a second shot. The blade positions have changed just to prove that they were actually turning. Note telegraph poles in the foreground to give you some idea of scale, and note there are no steel pylons.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a public meeting. If you want to make a contribution, you can have an opportunity, but please do not interrupt when someone else is speaking.
Okay, this is the turbine on the right of the road, and these are the turbines on the left. So there's 4 in all, and note there is no security fencing. This lady in the foreground, if you can see her, she's 5'2". Note that she's wearing a hat. It's not blowing off, and she's not having to hold it on. So it's not that windy at the ground level, though the rotors were turning quite happily. I had to get up pretty close before you could hear anything. It was refreshing to experience this for myself, especially after some of the less than complimentary things I've seen written about them. The level of sound they do produce pales into insignificance compared to a busy main road, let alone a motorway. So that's looking up at the hub. And this was my attempt to splice those 2 shots together. And that's a whole, one taken as a whole. Now, I took this one close to the base of the turbine 4, and note how close the land is that's still being cultivated. It's not taking up a great deal of space. Wind turbines, so for large-scale onshore renewable generation capacity, wind turbines have a relatively small footprint compared to other options. For example, let's just look at how big the footprint would have to be for a solar farm to match this output. And for an accurate comparison of wind to solar, we need to look at the yield. That's the actual units, the kilowatt hours generated per annum. The rated power might confuse us, and it's just for comparing one turbine to another or one solar array to another. So, I've corroborated this information with a leading other in the wind farm business for this site. And based on a 2 megawatt turbine, my figures are apparently more conservative than their most conservative figures, but I've rounded it down to the nearest million just for ease of mathematics. So the annual yield from one 2 megawatt turbine is 5 million kilowatt hours. That's a very conservative figure. And that would equal the yield, the annual yield from a 5 megawatt solar array. If you put all the panels end to end, like on a roof, that would take up 8¼ acres. But the reality is, though, that there is gaps between them. The panels need to be angled, so you don't want the next row behind in its shadow. They may need to be maintained and cleaned. And as you can see, you can't really cultivate between them. You certainly can't drive a tractor through it. Now, this is a 1 megawatt solar farm in Lincolnshire, installed by Ecotricity. This is 4.8 acres in size, and it's 5,000 panels. So 5 megawatts would be 5 times that, which is 24 acres and 25,000 panels. But to match the annual yield of 4 turbines, which is what's being proposed, you would need 4 times 24, which is equal to 96 acres and 100,000 panels, at least, because my figures are very conservative. So you're probably going to need closer to 100 acres of solar panels to match the output of these 4 proposed turbines. So, in conclusion, if we are to be grown up enough to shoulder our share of responsibility in greening the grid and reducing the damage to our environment, what are the options for large-scale electricity generation from locally available renewable sources in the Stratford district? Well, we're inland, so there's no sea power. There aren't too many opportunities for large-scale hydro. I don't think we have the suitable terrain. As we've seen, the solar farms take up a lot of space, and this technology is probably better suited to rooftop micro-generation. Biomass requires land to be given over to growing fuel, which would perhaps be better employed for heating. And so large-scale wind is actually a good option for us. It appears to be the least consequential, and wind turbines can always be taken down. The question of whether this particular green energy project goes ahead will be answered by the inspector at the end of this inquiry. My intention in being here today is to encourage all who are instrumental in that decision to embrace every opportunity to find good reason for its approval. And through all our considerations, let us keep in mind those who are destined to inherit the choices we make. Thank you.